The evening rush at Pete's Diner was winding down, the last traces of sunset painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Rain pattered steadily against the windows, creating a cozy atmosphere inside the warm restaurant. For Rose, a waitress who had been working there for the past 8 years, it was just another Tuesday night, until it wasn't. She was wiping down tables when she first noticed him, a small figure huddled outside the diner's entrance, seeking shelter from the rain under the worn awning. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, his clothes damp and his shoulders hunched against the cold. Rose watched as he pressed his face against the window, eyes fixed on the plates of food being carried to other customers. Something about his expression made her heart ache. She'd seen hungry people before. Working in a diner in downtown Chicago meant encountering all sorts of situations, but there was something different about this child. Maybe it was the way he tried to make himself invisible, or how he clutched his backpack like it contained everything he owned in the world. "Hey, kiddo," she called out softly, opening the door. "Would you like to come in? It's warmer inside." The boy startled, almost like a scared rabbit ready to bolt. His eyes, large and dark, darted between Rose and the street behind him. After what seemed like an eternal moment, he gave a tiny nod and stepped inside, leaving small puddles where his worn sneakers touched the floor. "I'm Rose," she said, leading him to a booth away from the windows. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" "On the house." He hesitated before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't have any money." "Don't worry about that," Rose replied, her smile genuine and warm. "Everyone deserves something warm on a night like this." As she walked to the kitchen, she could feel her coworker Dana's questioning look. Rose just shook her head slightly, she'd handle this one herself. She'd been in tough situations before, had known what it was like to go to bed hungry. Sometimes, all it took was one person showing a little kindness to change everything. The boy's eyes widened when she returned with not just hot chocolate but also a plate of chicken soup and fresh bread. "I can't," he started to protest, but his stomach growled loudly, betraying his hunger. "Eat up," Rose encouraged, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm on my break anyway. Would you like to talk?" He took a careful sip of soup, then another, bigger one. "I'm Tommy," he finally offered, tearing off a piece of bread. I ran away." Rose kept her expression neutral, though her heart raced. A runaway child, alone in Chicago, the scenarios running through her head weren't pleasant. "That must have been a big decision," she said carefully. "How long have you been on your own?" 3 days, Tommy replied, staring into his soup. "My mom, she died last year. Cancer." His voice cracked slightly. "Dad remarried 6 months ago, and my stepmom." He trailed off, pushing the spoon around in his bowl. Rose noticed the fading bruise near his wrist, partially hidden by his sleeve. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her voice gentle. "That must be really hard." Tommy nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "Dad's always working. He doesn't see, or maybe he doesn't want to see. She acts different when he's not around. Says I'm just making trouble, that I'm lying." He wiped his eyes quickly with his sleeve. "Nobody believes me." "I believe you," Rose said firmly, passing him a napkin. The words seemed to break something open in Tommy, tears began flowing freely now. What Tommy didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Rose was watching the security cameras above the register flicker to life. The owner of Pete's Diner rarely showed up this late, but tonight was different. Mr. Peterson himself had just walked in through the back entrance, his expensive suit out of place in the humble diner. Rose felt a strange tension in the air. Mr. Peterson stood frozen in the doorway to his office, his eyes fixed on Tommy with an intensity she'd never seen before. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking as he gripped the doorframe. The resemblance was subtle at first glance, but the more Rose looked between them, the more she saw it, the same curve of the nose, the same way of hunching slightly forward when upset. But it couldn't be, could it? She'd heard rumors about the owner's past, whispered conversations among the longtime staff about a tragic custody battle years ago, a missing child, a father who'd never stopped searching. But surely this couldn't be. Tommy continued eating, unaware of the drama unfolding behind him, unaware that his simple decision to accept kindness from a waitress on a rainy night was about to change everything. Rose sat there, her break long over, knowing she was witnessing something extraordinary but not yet understanding just how deep this story would go. The neon open sign buzzed quietly in the window, casting alternating red and blue shadows across their booth. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the old and making way for whatever tomorrow would bring. For now, though, Rose simply watched over Tommy as he finished his meal, her mind racing with questions about the man in the expensive suit and the impossible coincidence that had brought them all together on this ordinary Tuesday night. Mr. Peterson's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, stepping back into his office. Through the small window in the door, Rose could see him pacing, running his fingers through his graying hair as he made a call. She turned her attention back to Tommy, who was now warming his hands around the empty hot chocolate mug. "Would you like another?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. Tommy nodded, offering a small smile that transformed his entire face. It was the same smile she'd seen in the old newspaper clipping hanging in Mr. Peterson's office, the one showing him with his young son at the diner's grand opening, before everything fell apart. As Rose walked to the kitchen, Dana pulled her aside. "Rose, you need to see this," she whispered, holding up her phone. The screen showed a missing persons report from 8 years ago, Thomas Peterson Jr., age 4, last seen with mother Catherine Peterson during scheduled visitation. The photo showed a toddler with the same dark eyes as the boy sitting in their booth. "Mr. Peterson's been searching for his son all these years," Dana continued, her voice barely audible. "After his ex-wife disappeared with the boy, he hired private investigators, put up rewards, but nothing. The case went cold." Rose's mind raced as pieces started falling into place. Tommy had mentioned his mother dying from cancer last year, and now he was running from an abusive stepmother. But if he was really Thomas Peterson Jr., who was the woman who died? Who was the father he spoke of? The back door chimed as 2 police officers entered quietly, speaking in hushed tones with Mr. Peterson. Rose's heart rate quickened. She knew these next few moments would need to be handled delicately. Tommy had already been through so much trauma, the last thing he needed was more chaos and confusion. She prepared another hot chocolate, adding extra marshmallows, and returned to the booth. "Tommy," she said gently, sliding the mug across the table, "can I ask you something? What was your mom's name?" Tommy stared into the swirling marshmallows. "Catherine," he replied softly. "But everyone called her Kate." His fingers traced patterns in the condensation on the mug. She told me my real dad died when I was little. But sometimes, when she thought I was sleeping, I'd hear her crying and looking at old photos. She'd whisper, 'I'm sorry,' over and over." Rose felt her throat tighten. "Tommy, what's your full name? Your real one?" The boy's shoulders tensed. I'm not supposed to say. Mom always told me it had to be a secret. She said people would try to take me away if they knew." His voice quivered. "But she's gone now, and I don't want to keep secrets anymore. My name is Thomas Peterson Jr." The words hung in the air like suspended raindrops. Behind Tommy, Mr. Peterson had emerged from his office, the police officers flanking him. His face was streaked with tears, years of searching and heartache evident in every line of his expression. "Son." His voice cracked on the single word. Tommy whirled around, his hot chocolate forgotten. For a moment, time seemed to stop as father and son saw each other clearly for the first time in 8 years. Tommy's eyes widened with recognition, not of the man himself, but of something else. That That's the man from Mom's photos, he whispered, his voice trembling. She kept them hidden in a box under her bed. She said. He turned back to Rose, confusion and fear battling across his features. She said he was my real dad, but that he was dangerous, that he'd hurt us. That's why we had to hide. Mr. Peterson took a step forward, then stopped, his hands open in a gesture of peace. Tommy, your mother, she was sick, but not in the way you think. She suffered from severe paranoid delusions. I spent years trying to help her, to convince her to get treatment. When she took you, I never stopped looking. I never stopped loving you. The police officers remained respectfully quiet, understanding the delicacy of the moment. One of them, a motherly-looking woman with kind eyes, slowly approached the booth. Hi Tommy, she said softly. I'm Officer Chen. We've been working on your case for a very long time. Would you like to see some pictures? Some real documents that might help you understand? Tommy looked at Rose, seeking reassurance. She nodded encouragingly, though her heart ached with the weight of what was coming. The officer gently laid out several papers on the table, birth certificates, court documents, medical records, and photographs, so many photographs showing a happy family before illness tore it apart. Your mother loved you very much, Officer Chen explained gently. But she was very sick, and sometimes when people are sick like that, they believe things that aren't true. They do things they wouldn't normally do. Tommy's hands shook as he picked up a photo of himself as a toddler, sitting on Mr. Peterson's shoulders at a baseball game. I remember this, he whispered. We had ice cream, and you. He looked up at Mr. Peterson. You let me wear your cap even though it was too big. Mr. Peterson nodded, tears flowing freely now. It kept falling over your eyes, he said softly. But you wouldn't take it off. You wore it all the way home. The diner had grown quiet, the few remaining customers witnessing the scene with misty eyes. Rain continued to drum against the windows, but inside, something broken was slowly beginning to heal. Rose watched as Tommy stood up, taking tentative steps toward the father he'd been taught to fear. Mr. Peterson knelt down, meeting his son at eye level, careful not to make any sudden moves. I never stopped looking for you, he said quietly. Not for one day. And I never stopped loving you. Tommy's lower lip trembled. The woman I'm living with now, she's not nice. She hurts me. Never again, Mr. Peterson promised, his voice fierce with protection. You're safe now. You're home. And then, in a moment that brought fresh tears to everyone's eyes, Tommy took the final step forward and fell into his father's arms. 8 years of separation, of lies and fear and loss, began to melt away in that embrace. Rose wiped her eyes with her apron, knowing she had witnessed something miraculous. But as she watched father and son reunite, she couldn't help but wonder about the challenges that lay ahead. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. And somewhere out there was a stepmother who would need to answer for her actions. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and quiet conversations. Rose had closed up most of the diner, leaving only their corner lit as Officer Chen and her partner gathered details about Tommy's current living situation. Each revelation about his stepmother's abuse made Mr. Peterson's jaw clench tighter, though he maintained a calm demeanor for his son's sake. She locked me in the basement sometimes, Tommy explained, his voice small but steady as he sat close to his father. When Dad was away on business trips. She said if I told anyone, she'd convince him I was lying, that I was troubled because of my mom's death. He paused, looking up at Mr. Peterson. But she wasn't really my mom, was she? No, son, Mr. Peterson replied gently. Your mother. Catherine, she took you when you were 4. The woman who raised you. He struggled to find the right words. Officer Chen stepped in smoothly. We'll need to investigate this situation fully. Tommy, you mentioned your current home address earlier. We'll send officers there immediately to speak with your stepmother and the man you've been living with. Rose, who had been quietly making fresh coffee for everyone, noticed Tommy's hands begin to tremble. He's not a bad person, Tommy said quickly, defending the man he'd known as his father. He works a lot. He doesn't see what happens when he's gone. Mr. Peterson shared a meaningful look with Officer Chen. The implications were clear: there would be serious legal consequences for both the stepmother's abuse and the man's negligence, whether intentional or not. What happens now? Tommy asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned too young not to trust in certainty. Well, Officer Chen said, pulling out some additional forms, we've confirmed Mr. Peterson's identity and his legal custody rights. Given the circumstances and the documented history of the case, you'll be able to go home with your father tonight. We'll need both of you to come to the station tomorrow to complete some paperwork, and there will be follow-up interviews. Home? Tommy repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. Mr. Peterson squeezed his son's shoulder gently. I've kept your room exactly the same, he said softly. I never lost hope that I'd find you. The solar system mobile still hangs above your bed. You were obsessed with planets when you were little. Tommy's eyes lit up with a distant memory. I remember that. Jupiter was my favorite because of the big red spot. Rose watched the interaction with a warm heart, but she could see the exhaustion creeping into Tommy's posture. It had been an overwhelming day, and despite the joy of reunion, the boy was clearly struggling to process everything. Maybe we should get Tommy somewhere he can rest, she suggested gently. It's been quite a night. Mr. Peterson nodded gratefully. You're right. And Rose? He turned to her, emotion thick in his voice. I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't shown kindness to a scared, hungry child. Anyone would have done the same, Rose said, though they all knew that wasn't necessarily true. No, Mr. Peterson insisted. Not everyone would have. You didn't just feed him, you made him feel safe enough to tell his story. You listened. You noticed things others might have missed. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. I want you to call my office tomorrow. We need more people like you in our charitable foundation, people who understand that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives. Rose accepted the card, touched by the offer but even more moved by the sight of Tommy fighting to keep his eyes open, his head now resting against his father's shoulder. It was the trust in that simple gesture that brought fresh tears to her eyes. As they prepared to leave, Tommy suddenly straightened up. Wait, he said, his voice urgent. My backpack, there's something important in it. He pulled out a worn photo album, its corners softened with age. Mom, Catherine, she put this together. She wasn't well, I understand that now. But she did love me. And maybe. He looked uncertainly at his father, maybe you'd want to see some of these pictures? To know about the years you missed? Mr. Peterson's eyes welled up as he gently took the album. I'd like that very much, son. We can look at it together, and you can tell me everything you want to share, at your own pace. Officer Chen finished her notes and stood up. I'll escort you both home. We'll have officers stationed outside tonight, just as a precaution until we've fully handled the situation with. She glanced at Tommy, choosing her words carefully, the other parties involved. As they headed toward the door, Tommy suddenly broke away and ran back to Rose, wrapping his arms around her waist in a tight hug. Thank you, he whispered. For the hot chocolate, and for believing me. Rose hugged him back, her heart full. You're welcome, sweetheart. You're going to be just fine now. She watched through the rain-streaked windows as they drove away, father and son in the back of Mr. Peterson's car, Officer Chen following in her patrol vehicle. The neon signs cast their familiar glow on the wet pavement, but nothing about this night had been ordinary. Dana appeared beside her, shaking her head in amazement. You know, When you decided to give that boy some hot chocolate, you changed at least 3 lives tonight. 4, Rose corrected, looking down at the business card in her hand. Maybe even more. She thought about Mr. Peterson's charitable foundation and the possibility of helping other children in crisis. Sometimes the universe had a way of putting the right people in the right place at exactly the right time. As she finally locked up the diner for the night, Rose couldn't help but think about the challenges that still lay ahead for Tommy and his father. There would be adjustment periods, therapy sessions, legal proceedings, and the slow process of rebuilding trust. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets gleaming under the streetlights. Tomorrow would bring new developments in this extraordinary story, but for now, a lost boy had found his way home, thanks to a simple act of kindness and a hot chocolate on a rainy night. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Tommy's new old bedroom, dust motes dancing in the light. He lay awake, staring at the solar system mobile spinning slowly above his bed, just as his father had promised. The past 12 hours felt like a dream, but the familiar whoosh of Jupiter rotating past his head made it all feel startlingly real. Downstairs, he could hear his father moving around in the kitchen, the soft clink of coffee cups and the whisper of newspapers providing a soundtrack to this surreal morning. The house was exactly as he'd seen in those hidden photos, a beautiful brownstone in a quiet Chicago suburb, with large windows and warm wooden floors that creaked softly under his feet. A gentle knock at his door made him sit up. Mr. Peterson, Dad, he reminded himself, stood in the doorway with a hesitant smile. Breakfast's ready, if you're hungry. I wasn't sure what you like, so I made a little of everything. Tommy followed him downstairs, overwhelmed by the spread on the kitchen table: pancakes, eggs, fresh fruit, toast, and even chocolate chip muffins. His father had clearly been up for hours, probably unable to sleep just like Tommy. Is this okay? His father asked, the uncertainty in his voice matching the nervous flutter in Tommy's stomach. We can get something else if you'd prefer. It's perfect, Tommy interrupted, surprising himself with how much he meant it. He sat down at the table, watching as his father poured him a glass of orange juice with slightly shaking hands. The doorbell rang, making them both jump. Through the frosted glass of the front door, they could see Officer Chen's familiar silhouette. Mr. Peterson squeezed Tommy's shoulder reassuringly before going to let her in. Good morning, she said, stepping into the kitchen. Her eyes softened at the sight of the elaborate breakfast spread. I see someone's been busy. How are you feeling, Tommy? Better, he answered honestly, though better didn't quite capture the complex mix of emotions swirling inside him. Did you find them? Officer Chen shared a look with Mr. Peterson before sitting down at the table. Yes, we did. Your stepmother, Linda Reynolds, was taken into custody last night. We found evidence corroborating your statements about the abuse, including the basement. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The man you knew as your father, Robert Reynolds, is also in custody. He's being questioned about his role in all of this. Tommy's heart clenched. Despite everything, he felt a complicated surge of emotion at the news. Will they go to jail? That's very likely, yes, Officer Chen replied gently. But you don't need to worry about any of that right now. Your job is to focus on settling in here, getting to know your dad again, and healing. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat, clearly emotional. We have an appointment with Dr. Rivera this afternoon. She's a child psychologist who specializes in family reunification cases. And there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Tommy. He pulled out his phone, showing a text message. Rose, the waitress from last night? She's coming by later today. I've offered her a position heading up a new youth outreach program at our foundation, and she accepted. Tommy's face lit up at the mention of Rose. Really? She's going to help other kids like me? That's the plan, his father smiled. Sometimes the worst experiences can lead to something good, if we choose to make it so. Officer Chen nodded approvingly before turning serious again. There is one more thing we need to discuss. We've been investigating Catherine's final years. She pulled out a folder. It seems she did eventually seek treatment for her mental illness, about a year before she passed away. Her doctor's notes indicate she had begun to understand the gravity of what she'd done in taking you away. She left letters she never sent. Tommy's hands trembled as Officer Chen placed a bundle of envelopes on the table, all addressed to Mr. Peterson. His father stared at them, emotions playing across his face. She wanted to make things right, Officer Chen continued softly. But by then, the cancer had progressed too far. Her final letter explains everything, how her paranoid delusions had convinced her that you were in danger, Mr. Peterson. How she created a completely new life and identity. How the guilt ate at her as she began to recover with treatment, but by then she felt it was too late to undo what she'd done. Mr. Peterson reached for the letters with unsteady hands, but then stopped, looking at Tommy. We should read these together, when you're ready. They're part of your story too. Tommy nodded, grateful for his father's sensitivity. The magnitude of everything, the lies, the truth, the years lost and found, felt overwhelming. But there was also a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over him, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. The doorbell rang again, and this time it was several members of Mr. Peterson's family, Tommy's family, bearing welcome home gifts and tears of joy. His Aunt Claire, who he'd last seen as a toddler, couldn't stop hugging him. His cousin Pete, now a teenager, brought video games and offered to teach him all the cheat codes. As the house filled with the warmth of family and the aroma of breakfast, Tommy found himself watching his father. Mr. Peterson moved through the crowd of relatives with one eye always on his son, as if afraid Tommy might disappear again if he looked away too long. Their eyes met across the room, and Tommy felt something shift in his heart, a wall beginning to crumble, making space for something new to grow. Later that afternoon, as Rose arrived with ideas for the youth outreach program and more of the story about Linda and Robert emerged from the police investigation, Tommy sat in his father's study, holding the photo album he'd brought from his old life. Inside were pictures of birthday parties, school plays, and ordinary moments, memories of a life built on a foundation of lies, yet still somehow real in their own way. We can make new memories, his father said softly from the doorway. Better ones, honest ones. But you don't have to forget the good parts of those years. Catherine was sick, but she did love you. And everything that happened led you to that diner last night, to finding your way back home. Tommy looked up at his father, this man who had never stopped searching, never stopped loving him, and felt the first real smile of the day spread across his face. Can we put some of these pictures up? He asked. Next to the new ones we'll take? Mr. Peterson's eyes welled with tears as he nodded. Of course we can, son. Our story isn't just about where we end up, it's about everything that brought us here, and everything that lies ahead. Outside, the sound of children playing floated through the open window, a reminder that life goes on, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back home. The afternoon session with Dr. Rivera went better than anyone expected. The child psychologist's office was filled with soft light and comfortable furniture, creating an environment where Tommy felt safe enough to open up. Mr. Peterson sat nearby, close enough to offer support but far enough to give his son space to express himself freely. Sometimes, Tommy said, fidgeting with a stress ball from Dr. Rivera's desk, I dream about both houses at once. Like, I'll be in my old room, but I can see the solar system mobile from this one spinning above me. Is that weird? Not at all, Dr. Rivera replied warmly. Your mind is trying to make sense of two different lives coming together. It's perfectly normal. She turned to Mr. Peterson. How are you handling all of this? Mr. Peterson ran a hand through his hair, choosing his words carefully. I keep wanting to make up for lost time, to fix everything at once. But I know I can't rush this. Tommy needs space to process everything, and honestly, so do I. Dr. Rivera nodded approvingly. That's very insightful. Healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about understanding it and moving forward together. She looked at Tommy. Would you like to tell your father about what you mentioned earlier? About the letters? Tommy squeezed the stress ball tighter. I started reading some of Mom's, Catherine's, letters last night. The ones she never sent. He glanced at his father. She wrote about how sorry she was, how the doctors helped her understand that her fears weren't real. But there was something else. He hesitated. Mr. Peterson leaned forward slightly. Whatever it is, it's okay to share. She wrote about you searching for me, Tommy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She saw the news stories, the missing person reports. She kept every article about you never giving up. In her last letter, she wrote that she finally understood that your love for me was real, not dangerous like her sick mind had made her believe. Tears rolled down Mr. Peterson's cheeks. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day. Dr. Rivera gave them both a moment before speaking. This is excellent progress. Tommy, you're showing remarkable strength in dealing with these complex emotions. And Mr. Peterson, your patience and understanding are creating a safe space for Tommy to explore these feelings. As they left the session, they found Rose waiting in the reception area. She'd spent the morning at Mr. Peterson's foundation, already diving into plans for the youth outreach program. Her face lit up when she saw them. How would you both feel about getting some lunch? She suggested. I know this great little place around the corner. Tommy looked up at his father hopefully. Mr. Peterson smiled. Lunch sounds perfect. Though I have to warn you, Rose, you've set a high bar with your diner's cooking. The restaurant was a cozy Italian place, with red and white checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh garlic bread in the air. As they settled into their booth, Rose pulled out a tablet. I hope you don't mind if I share some ideas while we eat, she said. The Foundation's board is incredibly supportive of the new program. We're thinking of calling it, The Bridge, helping kids in crisis find their way to safety and support. Tommy listened intently as Rose outlined her plans. The program would work with local diners and restaurants to create safe spaces for vulnerable youth, training staff to recognize signs of abuse and neglect. There would be a 24-hour hotline, emergency shelter partnerships, and counseling services. Actually, Rose said, glancing at Tommy, we were hoping you might help us, when you feel ready. Your perspective could be invaluable in understanding what kids in similar situations need. Tommy sat up straighter. Really? You'd want my help? Mr. Peterson placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Only if you want to, and only when Dr. Rivera thinks you're ready. But your experience could help other children find their way home. Before Tommy could respond, his father's phone buzzed. The expression that crossed Mr. Peterson's face made Tommy's stomach clench. What is it? He asked, already knowing it had something to do with his old life. Mr. Peterson shared a look with Rose before answering. That was Officer Chen. Robert, the man you knew as your father, he's agreed to make a full statement. It seems he suspected something wasn't right with Catherine's story years ago, but he chose to look the other way. And with Linda. He paused, clearly angry. He admits he knew about some of the abuse but was too much of a coward to stop it. Tommy stared down at his untouched pasta, emotions churning. He wasn't all bad, he said quietly. Sometimes he'd bring me books when he came home from business trips. He taught me how to ride a bike. Those good memories are yours to keep, Rose said gently. But what he did, or didn't do, was wrong. You deserved better. You have better now, Mr. Peterson added softly. And we'll make sure Linda and Robert face consequences for their actions. Tommy nodded, then took a deep breath. "I want to help with the bridge program," he said, looking at Rose. "Not right away, but when I'm ready. Maybe my story can help other kids and not feel so alone." Rose smiled warmly. "I think that's a wonderful idea. And speaking of not being alone." She reached into her bag and pulled out a familiar-looking mug. "The diner staff wanted you to have this. It's the mug you used that first night, we all signed the bottom." Tommy turned the mug over, tears welling up as he read the messages of love and support from the diner staff who had witnessed the beginning of his journey home. "Family isn't just about blood," Rose continued. "It's about all the people who choose to be there for you, who help light the way when the path seems dark." Mr. Peterson raised his water glass. "To family, both the ones we're born with and the ones we find along the way." As they clinked glasses, Tommy felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the cozy restaurant. Here, surrounded by people who truly cared about him, he was beginning to understand what real love and support felt like. Outside, the Chicago afternoon buzzed with life and possibility. Tomorrow would bring more sessions with Dr. Rivera, more developments in the legal cases against Linda and Robert, more steps forward in the creation of the bridge program. But for now, Tommy was content to sit in this moment, watching his father and Rose discuss plans for helping other lost children find their way home, knowing that his own journey of healing was well underway. 2 weeks had passed since that rainy night at Pete's Diner. The courthouse loomed before them, its stone steps already crowded with reporters who had caught wind of the extraordinary story. Tommy clutched his father's hand as they made their way through the crowd, Rose walking protectively on his other side. Today was the preliminary hearing for Linda and Robert Reynolds. Tommy wouldn't have to testify, his recorded statement to the police would be sufficient, but he had insisted on being present. "I need to see it," he had told Dr. Rivera during their session yesterday. "I need to know it's really over." Inside the courthouse, Officer Chen met them with reassuring smiles. "Everything's ready," she said, leading them to a private waiting area. "The evidence is overwhelming. Linda's looking at serious time for child abuse, and Robert will face charges for child endangerment and negligence." Tommy sat quietly, processing this information. He'd been doing better, sleeping through the night more often, getting to know his father, even starting to make friends with some kids in the neighborhood. But this day had loomed over everything like a storm cloud. "Remember what we talked about," Dr. Rivera said, joining them in the waiting area. "Your feelings about today might be complicated, and that's okay. There's no right or wrong way to feel." Mr. Peterson squeezed his son's shoulder. "We can leave any time you want. Just say the word." But Tommy straightened his shoulders, a determination in his eyes that reminded Rose of the brave boy who had trusted her with his story that rainy night. "I want to stay." The hearing proceeded with the efficiency of well-prepared prosecution. Tommy watched from the gallery as Linda and Robert were brought in, both looking smaller somehow in their prison uniforms. Linda didn't meet anyone's eyes, but Robert looked directly at Tommy, his face a mask of shame and regret. The prosecutor presented the evidence methodically, photographs of the basement where Tommy had been locked up, medical reports documenting old injuries, testimony from neighbors who had suspected something was wrong but never reported it. Each piece of evidence made Mr. Peterson's jaw clench tighter, but he remained steady for his son's sake. What surprised everyone was Robert's statement. Given permission to speak, he turned to face Tommy directly. "I knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew something wasn't right with Catherine's story all those years ago. I knew Linda was hurting you when I was away. I told myself I was protecting you by staying quiet, by trying to keep the peace. But I was really just protecting myself." He wiped his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you deserve to hear the truth. I failed you, and I'm so sorry." Tommy leaned against his father, tears sliding silently down his face. Rose reached over and squeezed his hand, remembering how this brave boy had trusted her with his story that rainy night. Linda remained silent throughout the proceedings, but the evidence spoke volumes. The judge ordered both to be held without bail until trial, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges. As they were led away, Tommy felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Outside the courthouse, away from the reporters, Tommy finally spoke. "Can we go to the diner? I want to sit in our booth for a while." The diner was quiet at this odd hour between lunch and dinner. Dana was working, and her face lit up when she saw them enter. She immediately started preparing hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, just the way Tommy liked it. As they settled into what had become known as Tommy's booth, Rose shared some updates about the bridge program. "We've already partnered with 15 local restaurants," she explained, spreading out some papers. "Each one will have trained staff and a safe room where kids in crisis can wait for help. We're calling them bridge points. Like lighthouses," Tommy said thoughtfully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Showing the way to safety." Mr. Peterson smiled proudly. "Exactly like that. And guess what? Pete's Diner is going to be our first official bridge point. We're installing a special button under the counter. One press will alert all the right people that a child needs help." Tommy traced the rim of his mug, thinking about all the children who might sit in this very booth, scared and alone like he had been. "When can I start helping?" "With the program, I mean." Dr. Rivera, who had joined them at the diner, shared a look with Mr. Peterson. "You've been making excellent progress in our sessions. I think you could start with something small, maybe helping design the information cards we'll be placing in the diners. Your perspective on what would make a scared child feel safe enough to ask for help would be invaluable." Tommy's face lit up. "I already have some ideas. Like, maybe the cards could have a code word? Something that lets the staff know you need help without having to say it directly." Rose pulled out her notebook, already jotting down notes. "That's brilliant, Tommy. What else?" As they sat there, brainstorming ways to help other children find their way to safety, the afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting warm patterns across their table. Dana brought over a fresh plate of cookies, on the house, for our favorite customer, and Tommy realized something profound. "You know what's weird?" he said, looking around at these people who had become his family in different ways. "If none of the bad stuff had happened, if Mom hadn't been sick and taken me away, if Linda hadn't been so cruel, then the bridge program wouldn't exist. Other kids might not get the help they need." Mr. Peterson wrapped an arm around his son. "That's very wise, Tommy. Sometimes the hardest chapters of our story lead to something good, something bigger than ourselves." Speaking of stories, Rose added with a smile, "Wait until you hear how many restaurants contacted us after the news coverage of your case. People want to help. They want to be part of the change." Tommy looked around the diner, at the booth where he'd first trusted Rose with his story, at the counter where soon a special button would be installed to help other children like him, at these people who had become such an important part of his journey home. The road ahead still held challenges, the full trial, more therapy sessions, the ongoing process of rebuilding his life, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the Chicago streets in warm hues, and somewhere in the city, another child might be gathering the courage to ask for help. Thanks to Tommy's story and the people who had chosen to listen and act, that child would find more than just a hot chocolate and a sympathetic ear. They would find a bridge to safety, built from the pieces of a broken past transformed into something beautiful and strong. 6 months had passed since that first rainy night at Pete's Diner. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the parking lot as Tommy stood before a crowd of reporters, community leaders, and restaurant owners. At 13, he was probably the youngest public speaker most of them had ever seen, but his voice was steady as he addressed the gathered crowd. "A hot chocolate changed my life," he began, smiling at Rose who stood nearby. "It sounds simple, doesn't it? But sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes. 6 months ago, I was a scared, hungry kid with nowhere to go. Today, I'm standing here to help launch something that will change lives across Chicago. The crowd applauded as Tommy gestured to the newly installed sign above Pete's Diner, official Bridge Point, a safe haven for children in crisis. Similar signs would soon appear at 50 other restaurants across the city, with more joining every week. Mr. Peterson watched from the sidelines, pride shining in his eyes. The past 6 months hadn't been easy. There had been nightmares, tough therapy sessions, and the emotional drain of the trial. Linda had received a 15-year sentence for child abuse, while Robert was serving 5 years for criminal negligence. But through it all, Tommy had shown remarkable resilience. The Bridge program isn't just about providing safe spaces, Tommy continued, gaining confidence. It's about training people to recognize when a child needs help, and giving those children a way to ask for it safely. He held up one of the new menu cards that would be placed in every participating restaurant. At first glance, it looked like a regular menu, but it contained subtle markers and code words that children could use to signal they needed help. If you order a Sunshine Special, Tommy explained, it tells the staff you're in immediate danger. A Moonlight Milkshake means you need someone to call for help but aren't ready to talk about it yet. And just like the waitress who helped me, every staff member at these restaurants will be trained to notice the signs that something isn't right. Rose stepped forward then, taking her place at the podium. In the past 6 months, the Bridge program has already helped 23 children find safety. Each one of them has their own story, their own journey. But they all have one thing in common: they found hope in a moment of kindness. The ceremony continued with the official ribbon cutting, but Tommy's attention was drawn to a small figure hovering at the edge of the crowd. A young girl, maybe 10 or 11, clutching a backpack and watching the proceedings with intense interest. He nudged Rose and gestured subtly toward the child. Rose immediately understood. With the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before, she made her way through the crowd and approached the girl with a warm smile. "Would you like to come inside? We make a great hot chocolate." Tommy watched as Rose led the girl into the diner, knowing that another story of hope was about to begin. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder and leaned into the touch, grateful for how far they'd come in rebuilding their relationship. "Ready for the next part?" Mr. Peterson asked softly. Tommy nodded. They had planned something special for today, something that had taken months of preparation and emotional readiness. As the crowd began to disperse, they made their way to the small garden behind the diner where a newly installed memorial bench waited, covered in a cloth. Dr. Rivera had helped Tommy prepare for this moment during their sessions. It was his idea, a way to honor the complicated truth of his past while embracing his future. The small gathering of close friends and family watched as Tommy and his father together pulled away the covering. The bench was beautiful, made of polished wood with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Catherine Peterson, 1980 to 2023, may her story remind us that healing is possible, and that love, though sometimes lost in darkness, can find its way back to light." Tommy placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the bench, Catherine's favorite, he had remembered. "She was sick," he said quietly to the gathered group, "but she did love me. And in the end, she understood the truth. These flowers are to remember the good parts, while accepting the whole story." Mr. Peterson wrapped an arm around his son, both of them taking a moment to honor this complex piece of their shared history. Rose wiped tears from her eyes, remembering how far they'd all come from that rainy night 6 months ago. Inside the diner, they could see Dana serving hot chocolate to the young girl Rose had brought in, following the careful protocols they had developed. The girl was talking now, her posture gradually relaxing as she felt the warmth of safety and understanding. "That's what it's all about," Tommy said, watching through the window. "Turning our story into help for others." The day wound down with a small celebration in the diner. The staff had decorated with balloons and streamers, and Pete's famous chocolate cake was served to everyone. Tommy sat in his usual booth, surrounded by the people who had become his extended family: Rose, Dana, Officer Chin, Dr. Rivera, and of course, his father. As evening approached, Rose received a text from the crisis team. They were on their way to help the young girl who had found her way to them earlier. Another child would sleep safely tonight because of the bridges they had built from their own broken pieces. "You know what I've learned?" Tommy said, looking around at his assembled family. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead us to the best people. And sometimes the hardest stories to tell are the ones that need to be heard the most." Mr. Peterson raised his mug of hot chocolate. "To Bridges," he said softly. "To Bridges," everyone echoed, and Tommy felt the warmth of belonging wash over him. Later that night, as they drove home, Tommy looked out at the city lights twinkling like stars. The solar system mobile still spun above his bed, but now it was joined by new photographs, moments with his father, celebrations with his extended diner family, the opening of new bridge points across the city. His story had become something bigger than himself, a light in the darkness for others to follow home. The diner's neon sign glowed in the rearview mirror, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Somewhere in Chicago, another child might be gathering the courage to ask for help, to order a sunshine special or a moonlight milkshake. And when they did, they would find what Tommy had found that rainy night 6 months ago, not just a hot chocolate and a sympathetic ear, but a bridge to safety, built by those who understood that sometimes the greatest acts of love start with the smallest moments of kindness.